him about asking him to present on one of his books, Why Race and Culture Matters in Schools, Closing the Achievement Gap in America's Classrooms, and the role that race and culture play in a person's experience in the educational setting. And I know, looking around at which congregants are here, we have a lot of educators in the room, and so I know that we have a lot to learn. So I will turn it on over to Dr. Howard. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for having me this morning. I want to say good morning to all the congregants here from Claremont United Church. It's my privilege and my honor to be here with you this morning, and grateful for the opportunity just to come and share with you some of the work that I've been doing for the greater part of the last 25 years, and then really to move into a conversation with some Q&A. And just to give a little bit of my personal background, which I think helps to provide some context for the conversation for today. I'm a native Angelino, having been born and raised in Compton, California, where I grew up, went to school, and was fortunate enough to ultimately become a classroom teacher in the same district where I grew up. And, you know, one of the things I oftentimes say about my upbringing is that I had hardworking parents who did all that they could to provide my brother and I with the opportunities that we had. They both were part of the Great Migration of Black families who would move from the southern parts of the United States to Los Angeles. My dad coming in the early 1960s from Louisiana, and my mom coming from Texas in the 1950s. And they came to this state because, like many other African Americans during that Great Migration period, because they were looking for an opportunity to find a better way of life. They were looking for an opportunity to escape the real ugliness that was racism in the Deep South. They were looking for a way to essentially attain the American dream. And so California, in the eyes of many, represented that. So my brother and I are first generation born Californians. And we lived in an area that, when we grew up in Compton in the 70s, it seemed to be in many ways the American dream that I think my parents had dreamed of. But then we started to see some slow erosion of that community. And that erosion was really a byproduct of what I would call a lack of investment in the community, a lack of investment in our schools, lack of investment in the kind of spaces that young people are needed to thrive in. And so when we got to the 80s, much of the challenges that we faced were a byproduct of a community that had transformed tremendously, where crime and drugs and gangs became far more prevalent than they should have become. And so I give all that as a backdrop because part of what I say is that I think about my experiences in terms of being fortunate enough to navigate that and to be able to do what I do today. And it's not because there was something great about me. I always say, but number one, by the grace of God, that I am able to be here, do what I do. But the bottom line is I had people who saw something in me that at times I did not see in myself. And I cannot stress enough the importance of what education can do if done right. And it doesn't have to be an entire system, though that would help, but there were key people along the way who were really pivotal for me. My second grade teacher, I'll never forget, Miss Hill, was someone who always sort of elevated me in terms of telling me how smart I was. And that means the world to have a teacher who really stresses how much they see your potential. My fifth grade teacher, Miss Russell, was another one who was a hard teacher. She demanded nothing short of excellence. But you come to realize that people who really push you to be better are oftentimes doing that because they see something better in you. And I can go on down the line with a handful of teachers who really played a role in my experiences. But what oftentimes saddens me is that while I was fortunate enough to go to college, there were far too many of my peers who had just as much potential, who had just as much intellect, who had just as much promise, who did not get that opportunity. And I oftentimes wonder, how could our community, how could our society be better if what I was fortunate enough to receive, more of them, my peers that is, had those same opportunities. And what became even more disturbing for me is when I went to teach in the same community that I grew up in, the despair seemed to have gotten wider. The hopelessness seemed to have gone deeper, where these were young people who oftentimes didn't see or think or believe that there was possibilities to go on to college or to go on to a career. And so I raised all these things because part of what becomes clear in this conversation is that these communities that I'm referring to, like where I grew up, were predominantly comprised of African-American and Latino members. And so for me, as I studied, it became more evident as I looked at this work across the country, where we saw issues of poverty, where we saw great levels of hopelessness and despair, there tended to be a disproportionate number of people who experienced these issues that were either African American, Latino, Native American, and certain Asian American groups. And so this kind of led to me.
Tyrone, your microphone accidentally muted. There we go.
Yep. Okay. It led me to start to really ask some hard questions, and I've always been a bit of a history buff. And so part of those queries led me to understand that one of the things that's been a part of our fabric of this nation is that we were sort of established as a country, or even before we were established as a country. Some have oftentimes said that the original sin of this country was slavery. And slavery was a system of advantage that was dehumanizing to Black people. The economic foundation of this country was built upon the labor of Black people. The opportunities for upward mobility was severely compromised and not allowed to happen because of slavery. It was not just slavery that happened to African Americans, but also just the treatment of the indigenous populations, where Native Americans were forced off their lands, taken away from their language and their culture and their customs, and really some hard, hurtful things that happened to Native Americans still explain why they're in the situation today where they're not nearly as prosperous as we would like to see because of things that happened centuries ago. So I use all that as a backdrop to say that when you think about some of the histories that we have in this country around the treatment of different groups based on race and ethnicity, the lack of opportunity for certain groups, the legal sanctioning of discrimination, the inability to participate politically, sort of the ways in which socially and ideologically we've kind of sort of cast some groups as being inferior. The remnants are still with us to this day. And so here we are in 2020, and some might say, well, those issues happened centuries ago. We shouldn't have to deal with those issues anymore. Those issues are no longer pertinent. And I would argue that oftentimes when you have issues that you've never reckoned with and you've never dealt with and you've never tackled head on, that the remnants are still going to be there. Now, there are some folks who would say, well, why should we have to talk about these issues? Because I didn't own slaves. I didn't mistreat Native Americans. And this is true. No one today, or no one who's alive today, was directly involved in that. But what we try to talk about are the ways in which a system that benefited one group continues to have sort of the opportunities to provide sort of advantages today that other groups cannot have. And so to that end, I always try to use this example that we think about the fact that if you bought a home and the home was pretty old and the basement was pretty much in bad shape because your great-great-grandparents bought the home and they never really tended to the home, but there was some growing mold in the home and their refusal to really address some of the concerns of the home, over time it gets worse. And then 3-4 generations later, you inherit the home. Now the home is yours. And despite the fact that you did not engage in the neglect of that home, despite the fact that you did not contribute to the mold in that home, despite the fact that you did not tend to the baseboards of that home, the bottom line is you still are in the home and you have to address the issues of the home, even though maybe your great-great-grandparents were responsible for it. It's still our home. As far as race relations are concerned, we have to come to a reckoning to begin to talk about the ways in which, though we were not directly involved in some of these atrocities, though we were not involved in some of these discrimination and prejudice acts, that people still feel the effects of it today in 2020. And I think what we've seen over the last 6 months, especially with the rising of the police brutality issues, the fights to end systemic racism, the issues around the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, it's really brought to me, I think, a healthy awakening for us to have a conversation. I think one of the things that has made this difficult to address is that we've not really come to grips with the fact that having a very honest conversation about race and racism is something we've just not done. Race is one of the more taboo topics in our society. We typically don't like to talk about race because it brings up lots of emotion. People get very angry. People get very sort of agitated. And we really like to tiptoe around the topic because we're not sure what to say or how to say it. We don't know if we say something that is going to be misinterpreted, we might be labeled as racist. So we just avoid it altogether. We sweep it under the rug. And we know what happens with anything that you sweep under the rug. The more you sweep it under the rug, it only becomes this larger issue that at some point in time comes to a head. And I'm asking us that in this moment, And it's time for us to talk honestly about this set of realities, because here's one of the things we have to come to grips with. We as a nation, I think we have a phenomenal Bill of Rights and a constitution that talks about how we as a country operate as a government. But one of the things that we don't always sort of recognize, that our ideals don't always line up with our practices. I'll say this again, our ideals don't line up with our practices. One of my favorite books of all time is this book by a sociologist by the name of Gunnar Myrdal called The American Dilemma. And I find this book fascinating because what it is, Gunnar Myrdal is a Swiss sociologist in the 1940s who's in Europe, and he's reading about this great place called America. And he reads about the ideals of democracy and all men are created equal and all the principles that are part of our Constitution. And he says, wow, I've got to go to this place because I want to see what this looks like, because they are the beacon of democracy. They are the ideal society. I want to understand what it looks like in real time. So Myrdal, as a sociologist, comes to the United States of America in 1942 to see this great place called the United States of America up close in person. And how and why he chooses to come to Mississippi in 1942 is not clear, but he comes to Mississippi in 1942. Now, you all can imagine what it's like to come to, of all places in the United States of America, Mississippi in 1942. And when Myrdal comes to Mississippi in 1942, he is beyond shocked because he sees abject poverty, he sees this segregated society, he sees the mistreatment of poor people, he sees the mistreatment of Black people, and he's just completely befuddled at the fact that, wait a minute, this was a country that said it had these ideals and these sort of beacons of democracy and freedom and opportunity and equality. But when you talk to people here in Mississippi, they're saying that this is not the reality. And so he goes on to write this book and says that basically America has a dilemma. And that dilemma is you're going to either have to stop promoting these ideals that you are not living up to, or you're going to have to live up to these ideals. One or the other, but you can't have it both ways. You can't say that we're a country that believes in freedom and opportunity and democracy and pathways for upper mobility, but yet when you go into parts of this country, you see lots of widespread poverty, almost a caste system for some people feeling like they can't get out. So his argument around the American dilemma, I think, still rings true for us today, that we have a dilemma. And that dilemma is, are we going to be the perfect union that we're striving to become? Meaning we have to atone for our past doings. We have to be obviously clear about some of the racial sort of issues that we've had in this country. And we have to think about a path forward that's going to allow us to kind of create the kind of society that I believe that we all want to live in. So I want to be clear about this, that I study these issues because I find that we still don't know how to talk about race. And one of the things I think we have to do, I say 4 things we have to do to engage in what I call these courageous conversations. And to have courageous conversations about race and culture, but I think race is harder, and I'll talk about culture in a second. But these courageous conversations have to be based on these 4 principles. I think first and foremost, we have to stay engaged, meaning that when we start the conversation, oftentimes we don't like where it's going. We check out, we check our phones, we run to the restroom, or we daydream. So I always ask, my students, and when I do this work across the country, as we have these courageous conversations, stay engaged. No matter how awkward, no matter how emotional, no matter how much you might disagree, stay engaged in the conversation, because engagement provides the opportunity for us to continue to think and learn and grow. So that's the first thing. The second thing I ask folks to do when it comes to these courageous conversations about race is to be prepared to experience discomfort. Or in other words, what we say is get comfortable being uncomfortable, okay? Because issues around race are not always easy. We like to believe we're all in the same playing field, though we're not. We like to think about issues of racism being in the past, though they're not. So I think for many whites, not all, but for many whites, there's a sort of this difficult sort of space of saying, okay, do we really have to sit in this conversation because I feel guilty, I feel uncomfortable, I feel awkward? But we ask folks to be prepared to be uncomfortable. And I always say that if it's uncomfortable for some folks just to sit in this conversation and to listen, imagine how it feels for people of color who have to live in this skin every single day. So all we're asking for you is just to sit and hear and listen and empathize with the kinds of experiences that many folks of color go through. and begin to think about what can I do to become a change agent to eradicate those kinds of behaviors and that kind of sort of system. So we ask people to A, stay engaged, B, experience some discomfort. The third thing we ask is to speak your truth. What am I talking about here? Part of why we don't get to a better place in understanding race and racism is because we don't hear each other's stories. We don't listen to each other's narratives. I believe that truth exists on a continuum, not a hierarchy. I think we all have stories. I think our stories are powerful, but here's the thing that happens in America. I think we get so fixated on this that we don't really look at the hearts and minds of people who are in our midst. And I think that if we took the time to hear our stories and we spoke the truth to each other and we heard the stories, the journeys, the hopes, the dreams, and the aspirations, in many cases, we would find that we have far more in common than we have that's different. I'll say that again, that oftentimes we have far more in common than we have that's different. We all want the best for our families. We want to enjoy our loved ones. We want them to have happiness. We want them to be able to get along. We want them to be good people. That's the same kinds of hopes and dreams and aspirations that exist across the racial and ethnic spectrum. But because we get so fixated on stereotypes and beliefs that are not based in truth, we tend to not even open up our minds and our hearts for that possibility. So to that end, that third point is to speak your truth, listen to other people's story, because listening to other people's stories gives us the opportunity to learn and grow. And then the fourth thing I would say is that when we have these courageous conversations about race and racism, that it's important, it's critical, and it's so valuable to remember that we have to expect and accept non-closure, meaning that these conversations are not going to be had and we're going to all be done in an hour, and then we're going to all come together and sing Kumbaya and all these issues are behind us. No, these are conversations that are oftentimes ongoing. We have to leave the door open to come and revisit them, to reflect, to think, to meditate, to pray, to then come to say, okay, how can we be better? It's a constant conversation. It's a continuous journey. It's an ongoing marathon. So I maintain for us to be better here is that we're going to have to be prepared to recognize that there are opportunities and advantages that some of us have had that others have not. We have to understand that there are still remnants of racism that exist today, but racism is oftentimes this sort of this ugly system that gives some people opportunities that others are denied. But I think we have to be committed to being what I call anti-racist, meaning that we're working to change the systems and the structures and the practices and the attitudes and the beliefs that somehow place one group above another group. That should never happen. We should see all groups as being able to participate in a society in an equal footing in ways that anybody who wants to live their life to the degree of recognizing their goals, hopes, dreams, and aspirations can do so. So I think we have to have this racial reckoning. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be convenient. It's not going to be comfortable. I think we can do it. We made progress. We are a much better country around this topic today than we were 50 years ago. It is my hope that we will be better 50 years from now than we are today, but it's a long, arduous, at times treacherous journey, but I think it's one we can get to. So we have to understand, what is it that I feel as a Black man when I walk into a department store and I have someone who follows me around as if I'm going to somehow do something wrong. It's about understanding when I explain to you that to this day, and I'm 51 years old, if a police officer pulls up behind me and is trailing me, that my heart starts to palpitate in ways that suggest that if I don't do something right, that could lead to a bad outcome. It's about the conversations that myself and other people of color have with their children about the fact that if they are stopped by law enforcement and the police officer asks you questions, here are the things you are to do. Everything is yes, sir, no, sir. Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. Here are my hands. I'm reaching for my registration. I'm reaching for my driver's license. I'm reaching for my car insurance, to walk them through everything that you're doing, because we know all it can take is one wrong move that can end up very badly. So when people of color talk about the experiences of what it feels like to somehow be looked at through certain kinds of lenses, it's not comfortable. The kinds of ways we have to explain to people that we have a right to be where we are, how it feels when you're the only person of color in certain spaces. I always like to use this example that much in the way I think about race, I also think about gender. So for example, women in our society have certain experiences that men could never understand. Women have to think about, when I go outside, what do I have on today? Where can I go? Where should I not go? Because if I go to certain places at certain times, it's not safe for me. The comments that men make to women that questions their ability to be seen as fully human, the ways that women are oftentimes sort of seen as being less than, despite the fact that they're just as qualified and just as credentialed as men. Women have sets of experiences that men could never understand. And it's important for us as men to hear women talk about those stories, to share their struggles, to talk about, for many women in our society, even in 2020, you get the message you have to work twice as hard to get just as far as men do. Even in this country today, we know that women make about 76 cents on the dollar compared to men for the same amount of work. So much in the way, like I talk about racism, sexism is a system of advantage that has put women at a severe disadvantage for centuries. And so when women are talking about their experiences, I don't think we should say, well, it's not that bad. I don't think we should try to minimize it. I don't think we should try to somehow say, well, you know what, get over it. I don't think we should tell women, you know what, you just have to work harder. I don't think we should tell women, you know what, I know a woman who's doing quite well, so if you could just do like she did, you'd be just fine. We have to stop putting that responsibility on the persons who have been the victims of centuries of discrimination and say, where can we, as the individuals who have the privilege when it comes to gender, men can be better at creating a more equitable society when it comes to gender. Same thing with race. What oftentimes frustrates people of color is that we are pouring our hearts out to say, let me tell you how we feel. Let me tell you what we go through. Let me tell you how people treat me. Let me tell you how people oftentimes ask for my credentials in ways they don't ask for my white colleagues' credentials. I gave this story of being at UCLA. I worked at UCLA for 20 years. And we have a library where you can check out books for faculty. I stood in line about 5 years ago and I watched 4 other colleagues of mine, all white, who went to check out books and had no problems. All they did was give their give their library card and they checked out books. I came into the same place in line and the woman behind the checkout counter said, this is for faculty members only. I said, I know, that's why I'm here. She said, I don't think you understand. These are only for the professors here at UCLA. I said, ma'am, I know that, that's why I'm here. She said, well, I need to see your ID proving that you're a faculty member. I said, I just sat in this line. I watched you ask 4 other people just to give you their library card. You didn't ask a single one of them to give you their faculty card. Why do I have to give you my faculty card? I'll give you my library card. She said, I need your library card and your faculty card because this line is for faculty members only. It's these kinds of experiences that oftentimes people of color say, why do I have to somehow prove, convince, persuade you that I am who I am? But this is just common what many folks of color say that they go through on a day in, day out basis, to the point sometimes we say we're just accustomed to it. We're just used to it. No one should ever have to be accustomed or to get used to being treated as a second-class citizen based on your race, based on your gender, based on your socioeconomic status, based on your religious affiliation. No one should ever be subjected to that. So I maintain that we have to have these conversations, listen to the experiences, and all check ourselves, because what happens is that we all can be victims, or we can all be guilty, I should say, of having what's called implicit bias. And there's a lot of research looking at implicit bias, and implicit bias is the ways we get socialized. And we receive these ugly negative messages about different groups. And if we're not careful about this unconscious bias or this implicit bias we have, we automatically see somebody and we think the things that society has told us about them. So society has told us that those people are seen as bad. The next time I see one of those persons who is a member of that group, I automatically think something's bad about them. If I'm told that this person over here is part of a group and they do awful things, we tend to make these associations in ways that are quite harmful and destructive. So I'm asking us to just be more careful, thoughtful, reflective, ask what can I do? How do I engage in conversations? How do I listen to the realities and experiences of those who are different from me? Because if we listen to those experiences, I maintain that's important for us to then move to the point of saying that this right here does not matter. This is the racial part of who we are. This is just our external map. If you really want to know who we are, I think we are cultural beings. Culture is what I think is critical. Culture are the customs and the norms and the traditions and the language and the celebrations and the rituals that we all engage in. Now, I want to make this point clear, because what we tend to do is we tend to base on people's racial identifications who they are. But if you want to know who I am, understand how I value my family, understand how I love God, understand how I view work ethic as something that's really important, understand the ways in which I believe in trying to help those who are less fortunate. The cultural norms of who I am is what makes us who we are. And to this end, here's where we oftentimes get in trouble. We tend to think that people who are of the same race this right here, share the same cultural values and cultural norms. And that is not always the case. You can have two people who are of the same racial background, but have very different cultural norms. Does that make sense to everyone? Just because you're the same race doesn't make you the same culturally speaking. I'll give an example. Many of you on this call, I'm sure, have brothers or sisters. So you can have a brother or sister who you all have some of the same DNA, same sets of chromosomes, but you are night and day in terms of how you live your lives. You were raised by the same people, but had a lot of the same experiences, but you are totally different in terms of the day-to-day ways that you live your lives. So though you are similar racially, similar from a DNA standpoint, culturally speaking, you can be very different. So just because people are the same race doesn't mean that they're culturally the same. Conversely, you can have two people who are different racially. So I can be African American, someone can be white, and we may have far more in common culturally than you would ever imagine. Because if you understand my values and the way I live my life and the way I think about my family and the way I go about my work, I have far more in common with somebody who's very different from me. And that's, to me, the real sad part. We never take the time to get to know people because we get fixated on the exterior. We say, because that person looks this way, we look at the outward appearance and we think that's who they are. I know all about them just based on this. And not breaking those barriers, not tearing down those stereotypes, not eliminating those, pulling back the curtains and say, tell me who you really are. Because I maintain that if we took the time out to understand who people were culturally at the core, that's who we find out who people are. That's how we live. That's how we learn. That's how we thrive. That's how we grow. That's how we create a much more racially inclusive society. But until we begin to sort of cast away these ugly stereotypes that have plagued our society, until we eradicate these ugly racial sort of scripts that we've all been exposed to over our lifetimes, until we begin to really recognize that as much as we like to stress in our society, in this country, that we believe in meritocracy, that if you try hard, that you get farther, that there are some groups who've been trying hard for centuries. And the harder they try, oftentimes the more they continue to come into obstacles. Until we recognize some of the ways that systemically there are certain groups, women, people of color, the poor, continue to fight for their own humanity, but continually get knocked back down, we're still not going to get there. So I'm a hopeful, optimistic person. I believe that we can be better. I believe that we will be better. But I think it takes courageous, bold individuals such as ourselves here to really begin to do some inward work, some reflective work, to say, where can we be better? How can we be better? How do we illuminate the voices of those who are oftentimes rendered sort of voiceless? How do we shine the spotlight on ugly, deep-seated inequities that still exist in our society? I'm an educator. And so one of the things I'm oftentimes saddened by is I look at, for example, something we do with what we call per pupil expenditures. How much money do we spend on children each year in our schools? And there are some districts in our very great state of California where we may spend $10,000, $11,000 per year to educate a young person. But then you can go 10 miles away and they spend $25,000, $30,000 per year to educate a pupil, 3 times as much. That's deep-seated inequity. Even during this pandemic, another thing that we've seen is that more of our affluent communities have been able to create what we call learning pods. And these learning pods are where you've had families who've gotten together, they brought together their children because they can afford to bring in a high-priced tutor. They allow to use someone's backyard or garage, they social distance, and they're giving kids additional instruction because they're not getting the same instruction at school. These learning pods have become quite popular in more affluent communities. Well, guess what? Poor communities don't have the resources or the means to create learning pods. And at the end of the day, those kids who are not getting the opportunity now will fall even further and further behind their peers who are able to get those kinds of opportunities. So inequities are still deeply seated in our society. I think we have to call it out when we see it. We have to advocate for those who are oftentimes less served. I think that at the end of the day, as we look at the shift in our country, and California is right now one of 5 states that is what we call a minority majority state, meaning that we have more people of color in our state than we have white people. 4 other states. And what demographers tell us that in the year 2040, which is now 20 years away, the United States will be a majority minority country. When you look at the birth rates, the trends of who's having more children, we see more people of color are having children. So I say that we have to understand this, and then I'll stop for some Q&A. These issues that I'm talking about are not Black problems. They're not white problems. They're not Latino problems. They're not Asian American problems. They're not Native American problems. They're American problems. And it's going to behoove us as Americans to finally understand what we can do to create a better, more inclusive society so that no group of people feel like they are on the outside looking in. Because if you look at the trends of where we are becoming as a country, it's going to be incumbent for us to make sure that the groups who will soon be the largest groups in our state are not the groups that are left behind. So I'll stop right there. I've kind of covered a lot of ground, hopefully giving you some food for thought. I want to see if there's any questions or concerns or disagreements about anything I've just shared.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Howard. Everyone, feel free to jump in, unmute yourself, and ask a question. I'd like to start off, if it's okay. Peggy, I saw your hand raised. You can go ahead and jump in afterward. But Dr. Howard, our congregation, as we're attempting to do anti-racist work, we're oscillating between a posture of learning and listening, and then trying to shift into a posture of action. And we just finished as a congregation reading Dr. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he wraps up by saying, it's essential to any learning or work that you're doing has to also target policies. So I'm curious if in our own communities, and we represent a lot of different cities around the Inland Empire here, are there any policies that we should be targeting? Is there anything we should be going to our school district meetings about and advocating for in order to help race and culture matter more in the curriculum, closing achievement gaps? Do you have any action items that you would give our congregation?
No, I appreciate that. So two things come to mind. I first of all, I truly applaud you for taking this sort of topic head on and engaging in the work so you can be part of the change that we all want to see. From a school standpoint, there is something. Some districts are doing a better job than this than others, but in this moment right now, what we are seeing is that distance learning has become the norm. Remote learning is the norm, but we are still seeing that there are many children who do not have access to devices. There are many children who do not have access to hotspots. I think that school districts have to do whatever they can from a policy standpoint to see to it that they will take every step necessary to ensure that every child has access to a device. So the policy should be that if we're going to do distance learning and learning now has to happen on our laptops, that there should be no child. I'm talking to families now where they're saying that the mother or father uses his or her cell phone for the way for students to access their learning. That's not going to be ideal. Or in some cases, there may be 3 children in the house, but there's only one device. So how do 3 children get access to their education if there's only one device? Or the issue around the hotspots. So even if I have a device, we know that there are some parts of our respective communities where the internet is non-existent or very weak. So how can I participate in learning if there's not a hotspot here? So I'm asking all of the advocates and allies who are wanting to do right with regard to our young people in this moment education to fight for policy to ensure that internet accessibility is available to each and every student. I think that's the very basic that we can provide. So I would offer that. Second thing I would offer, what I'm hearing more and more about now, because this has an implication because we know that in many of our communities, the majority of our students are usually Black and brown children. And so they're the ones suffering the most here. The second thing I would also offer from a policy standpoint, and this really requires us to get involved with our Board of Supervisors, is that we are seeing significant rates in homelessness in this pandemic, because we know that many families have lost jobs. And if they lose jobs, we know that they are losing income, and the ability to pay rent, it becomes even more challenging. Some cities and some counties have put in place an eviction moratorium, meaning that they would not engage in evictions during this time. But I've learned that there are some cities across Southern California that have lifted those moratoriums, meaning that now families who are not able to pay rent are being put on the streets. And disproportionately in Southern California, we know that those who are likely to be homeless are African-American and Latino. So I would ask that we think about what pressures we can put on our elected officials, our Board of Supervisors, our mayors, our city council persons to ensure that we keep these moratoriums in place that don't allow evictions to occur. And really at the end of the day, the moratoriums I think help in the short run, but my concern is only a Band-Aid, because when the moratoriums are lifted, then renters are expected to pay all the back rent that they haven't paid for the past 4 or 5 months. So think about this for a second. My rent is $2,000 a month. And even if I was given a moratorium where I wasn't required to pay rent for the last 4 months because I lost my job, when the moratorium is lifted, now I'm going to pay back my back rent, which is $8,000. How do I have $8,000 to pay when I don't have a job? I don't have a sense of income. So that's where I'm concerned, where we're going to see a tremendous spike in those who are experiencing homelessness. And we know that homelessness is not a good set of experiences for anybody, but especially for our children.
All right, thank you. Those are great action points for us. Peggy, did you want to jump in?
Yes. Hi, Tyrone. Nice to meet you. And thank you so much for being here
today. Thank you, Peggy. Yes.
So I loved what you said at the beginning about your personal experience with public education. I'm a product of Los Angeles Unified School District, and both my parents and my brother were teachers in that district. So I had this perspective on public education being really important for addressing some of these issues that you've talked about. But I understand the disparities, particularly in LA Unified. So my question is about this movement of charter schools that supposedly allow an opportunity for a community and a group of parents and educators to address the specific needs and so on. It's part of this school choice thing. I don't know, that makes me nervous. I wonder what your perspective, and maybe you have data on that from your research.
So great question, Peggy, and thank you for your correspondence. But so the charter school issue has been one that's been really, really controversial for a long time. Just to give a really brief overview for those who may not be familiar, charter schools emerged in the 1990s as a way to give families an alternative to the traditional public schools. And this really operated from the idea that people were not satisfied with the traditional public schools, the traditional neighborhood schools, and they felt like they didn't have an option, they didn't have a choice. So charter schools emerged to say, well, look, if we decide that we, as the Claremont United Church, want to formally put together a charter, say we are going to open up a school because we think we can do better than the neighborhood school, which means that the funding would come from the district to allow us to open up our own school. We would have to come up with our own building, our own funding plan, our own curriculum. We would not be sort of held to the same standards as the district schools, but because we are given more autonomy. And we would be given a 5-year charter, and the 5-year charter, we would be given the opportunity to show that we're doing better. Well, here's what we know is that number one, charter schools are essentially taking money away from the traditional public schools because schools are driven by enrollment. The more students I have in my building, the more money that my school gets because we have this formula called the ADA, average daily attendance. So if I went from having 500 students in my school, charter school down the road opens up and they take 200 of my students. Now I've only got 300 students, so I receive significantly less funding. Now, if the charter school is better, I don't have a problem with that. But the research on charter schools has been mixed. We are finding that some charter schools are slightly better than the traditional public schools. Most of them are about the same, but there are a growing number who are doing worse than the traditional public schools are. So here we are taking money away from the traditional public schools to put into another model. And that model is giving us pretty much either the same return on investment or in some case, a worse return on an investment. And so that's why there are many people who are really opposed to charters because we're taking money away. And here's the other advantage that charters have. Charters are able to pick and choose what students they want in their schools, whereas traditional public schools are not given that option. Traditional public schools have to take all comers. Charter schools typically, take most comers, but if there's a child who has special needs or an IEP that is more than we can provide support for, they may choose not to take that student. I've been oftentimes asked this, are you pro-charter or are you anti-charter? And I say the following, I am pro-children. So whatever format that exists that can do an adequate job of educating our children, I will support it. There are some charter schools that are doing well and I support them. I think we should learn from them. We should study them. We should try to replicate them. And there are some traditional public schools that are doing well and we should look at them and study them. But there are also some traditional publics that are doing poorly. And there are also some charters that are doing poorly. I think bad education, we need to call it on the carpet and say that it's inexcusable because no parent should be left with bad options for their children's education.
Excellent. Bob Fass, I see you have a hand up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howard, for doing this today. It's really important. I'm in the process of running for the school board in Claremont, and this is an important topic to me. there's an article that came out a few days ago in Time Magazine that's entitled "Want to Support Black Students, Invest in Black Teachers." It was written by Erica and Michael Hines. And I was surprised in my campaign to learn that we do not have any Black teachers at Claremont High School, which is a school of 400 students. That's a concern for me. So I was wondering if you could talk about that.
No, great topic. Thanks for running for school board, Bob. We need people who want to get involved and help make the system better. So here's what we know. We're becoming more diverse as a society. Our student population is becoming more racially and ethnically diverse, but our teaching population is not. What we know nationally is that white teachers make up about 82% of all classroom teachers, and teachers of color about 15, 16%. So everybody's struggling with this. How do we find more African-American teachers? How do we find more Latino teachers? Here's what the research also tells us, that African-American students do better when they have at least one African-American teacher, just one. But unfortunately, many African-American students go through an entire 12 years and don't see a single African-American teacher, right? We also know that Latino students do better when they just have at least one Latino teacher. You cannot really stress the importance enough of the role model impact. Seeing someone who looks like you, seeing someone who might be able to identify with you, seeing someone who can sort of be a role model is invaluable, it's priceless. But we have to do a better job of finding ways to get more Black teachers into our schools. So what do? I think we've got to be able to reach out to colleges, universities. We've got to engage in recruitment fairs. You can go to places like Cal State San Bernardino, Cal State LA, and begin to make the pitch of why we want to have these teachers of color consider Claremont as a place to teach. I think you're right, Bob. It's inexcusable that Claremont High School doesn't have a single African-American teacher. What I hear school officials say is, well, guess what? They don't apply to come work at our school. And that's the approach that has gotten us into trouble. We can't sit back and wait for them to come to us. We have to go out and actively recruit them because we want them to know that we want them to come to our school. My middle son is a graduate of Morehouse College. He is a classroom teacher. And the reason why he got involved in teaching, though he said he would never do it, is because school districts came to his campus, historically Black college university, and said, we want you. Just like we recruit student athletes, we identify them, we tell them how great they are, how amazing they are, how much we would love to have them on our campus. We have to do the same thing with these young men and young women who are on historically Black colleges and universities. Here in Southern California, we have a number of Hispanic serving institutions. We need to be on those campuses, recruiting, telling them the benefits of teaching, the kind of social impact you can have on teaching. Some folks think that teachers don't get paid that much. Well, many districts now start off about $50,000, $53,000, $54,000. You talk to a college student who's about to start a career and they have lots of student debt, working for $52,000, $53,000 a year for 9 months out the year with 3 months off is not a bad gig. I think we have to do a better job of really sort of making the case for why we think these young people could really do well in education. My son moved to Houston, Texas, because Houston, the school system he worked for, said we will go find young Black men. We want young Black men in our schools, and they recruited them hard, and they did not let up until they got more of them in their schools. I think we have to use a similar approach.
Yeah, the research is staggering on the role that a teacher of the same race as a student plays on achievement and experience. So to find out that there's no Black teachers at Claremont High School is a travesty. There's an action item for everybody, right? That's unacceptable. Thanks for that question. Dr. Morales?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Howard. I greatly appreciate your remarks. And it is a tragedy for Claremont High School not to have one single African-American teacher. I'd like to go back to the charter school comment. I was anti-charter school for a very, very long time until I served on the panel for educational policy, which is basically the Board of Ed for the New York City public school system. And I saw so many Black and Latino poor parents coming in support of charter education, charter schools, because the public schools in their neighborhoods was simply failing their children. And it really gave me insight into what your comment was, and that is, children first. It's not about charter school first, it's not about public education first. It's about children first. And if we can't change public schools to better meet the needs of poor people, regardless of race, because it's much of it has to do with class, we're just not going to, our society is not going to benefit at all. But thank you, Dr. Howard, for being in. Thank you, United Church of Christ, for having you here. It's great.
Thank you. And you're right that these issues are hard to dissect, but it's issues of race and class that really make this a complicated situation. So I appreciate your comments.
Go ahead, Donna. You're muted, Donna.
So grateful you are here, Dr. Howard. You are so on point, so on point. Old school superintendent here. Can you make some comments about incredible bias in the curriculum? Even 2020, our curriculum is beyond biased. And I'm an old lady. I retired out urban education. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for your service, for what you've done for our young people. So we could spend a whole hour plus talking about the curriculum. This is one of the areas I think that we fail our young people, because too many of our young people who are overwhelmingly Black and brown continue to engage in a curriculum that doesn't look like them, that does not reflect them, that doesn't speak their language, that doesn't talk about their experiences, that doesn't honor their history, that doesn't talk about their contributions. And this is one of the reasons why we lose so many young people. The research has been clear on this one too, Pastor, is that when young people are able to engage in a curriculum that looks like them and that is reflective of their experiences, their levels of interest go up, their levels of engagement go up, their levels of effort go up, and in some cases, their actual academic outcomes improve as well. We look at a report that the University of Wisconsin puts out an annual report looking at the makeup of characters in children's literature. They look at all the different children's literature across the board. They just put out their 2019-2020 report and found that 55% of all characters in children's literature were white characters. And that the second largest group was animals, where about 20% of all characters in children's literature were animals. And then after that was African Americans, were about 8% of all characters. Latino children were about 5% of characters. Asian Americans about 2%. So overwhelmingly, kids are more likely to engage in literature that either was white character or animal character. So that means as a child, I go through a textbook, I go through a piece of literature, and I don't see anybody who looks like me. I don't see anybody whose family looks like mine. I don't see any language that resembles what we speak in my household. Why am I interested? Why am I even taking my time out to read about something that has nothing to do with me? So the point about curriculum is so spot on in terms of what it looks like. I think if we want to talk about anti-racist work, having school boards take a close look at the textbooks that they even adopt and put in front of our students, there should be a community governing board that reviews the materials. And if the materials don't look like the students who are actually being served, then they should not be allowed. This is the important point, because textbooks in schools are $1 million business, $1 million business. And I think it's more than acceptable and more than fair to hold these textbooks accountable to say, if you want to come into our district, you need to create programs and curriculum that's reflective of our community.
Thank you, thank you.
Amy Duncan.
Thank you, Dr. Howard. I wish we had more time with you.
Oh, yeah.
Capitalizing on what you just said about student engagement in learning. Can you speak to the over-identification of Black males when it comes to suspensions and expulsions?
Yeah, you kind of hit a chord right there with me. That is one, Amy, that I've cared about, written about for a long time, because one of the more detrimental things that we do is that we have the suspension policies that are really archaic, that are oftentimes draconian, and they're at the core racist. And that may sound extreme, but I ask every school district that I work with to take a look at their discipline data, because you can access it on the U.S. Department of Education. And what I see over and over again are Black students, Black boys who may make up 5, 6, 7% of the population, but sometimes are 50, 60, 70% of the students who are being suspended. Now, some people say, well, if they're the ones doing most of the bad behavior, then they should be suspended. Well, that's not oftentimes the case. because frequently what we are seeing is that Black students engage in some of the same behavior as their white peers, but their white peers are oftentimes given a pass or not held to the same standard. So same behavior, different treatment. The other deeper concern that I have is the following. So we need to have a long, hard talk in this country about race, which I mentioned earlier, but the other topic we need to talk about is social emotional well-being, mental health. We don't like to talk about mental health in our society because we see mental health challenges as a sign of weakness. We see it as a sign of somehow being crazy. But I maintain that so many of the students who get suspended are oftentimes suspended because you have young people who have experienced traumatic events and they don't oftentimes know how to articulate what they need. So therefore, students who are angry are punished for being angry. Students who are experiencing homelessness and who can't stay awake in class are punished for being homeless. Students who oftentimes talk back, because what we know is that traumatized people are hurt, and we know hurt people hurt people. So therefore, instead of us wrapping our arms around them and putting the social emotional supports with counselors and mental health therapists and social workers, we take the behavior at the surface, not understand the root cause, and the very students that we should be bringing closer to us, we push them away. And let me tell you this, we know this, that students who are suspended don't come back better. They don't come back nicer. They're basically missing out on more time. And we look at the data, we see Black boys, language learners, and immigrant students are more likely to be suspended than anybody else. And I maintain it's those students who are oftentimes looking for support, who need additional affirmation, who need certain types of interventions. But because we don't understand them, we see their different behavior as being deficient. We see their different behavior as being sort of defiant. And I maintain that the very students who are oftentimes seen as problems in one classroom, they go to another classroom with another teacher, and that teacher has zero problems with them. So how is it that teacher A is able to get that student to sit down and work and do some phenomenal things, but teacher B says that this student is disrespectful and defiant? I think a lot of this comes down to the relationships, knowing and understanding who our students are. And the teachers who are able to formulate those relationships make a huge difference to help those students feel welcome, to make them feel included, and ultimately to help them learn in their classroom.
Thank you very much. You just identified the changes that could happen that would change the school to prison pipeline immediately.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Howard. Everyone, I think we've just soaked up a lot of information here. Just to kind of recap a little bit, access to technology in hotspots, eviction moratoriums to prevent homelessness, recruiting teachers of color, books and curriculum that reflect the identity of the students, a community governing board that could review that material, looking at suspension policies. These feel like things that we could do in our cities, in our areas to some degree. So I hope that we can, as Dr. Howard said, continue the conversation, be uncomfortable, and act to make these sorts of changes, because this isn't going to happen overnight, but it's going to require us to do long-term work here. Can we give some sort of digital round of applause and gratitude? I hope you can see us applauding. That was just incredible, and we're so grateful.
Thank you, Pastor, for having me. Thank you all for doing this important work that you're doing, and let's be the change that we want to see.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Howard. Thank you, everybody. Worship starts in just a few minutes, so we'll see you online for that. And we look forward to continuing to look at what research and work you do. So thanks for leading our communities, Dr. Howard. Have a good day.
Thank you all. Thank you.